Social Inclusion in the Classroom by Rhiannon Cetinski. Mrs. Brown unlocked the door to her classroom. Checking everything was tidy, she walked over to her desk, quickly checking over the plans she had for the upcoming term. At the start of the year, Mrs. Brown was given a Year 4 class. Like the rest of the students at Silver Lake Public School, the class was predominantly made up of children from a mixture of middle and working class families. Mrs. Brown understood the importance of addressing social inclusion in her classroom, particularly social class, due to the different social backgrounds the children of the class came from. Her goal for the term just starting was to create equal opportunities for all students within the class, regardless of their economic status. As Mrs. Brown reflected on her goal, she considered how attitudes towards social class have changed over time. In the decades following the Industrial Revolution, theorists came trying to explain the new classes within their society. Karl Marx, an influential 19th century socialist, believed society could be split into two classes: the working class, who worked for a little wage and held little power, and the capitalists, who were the upper class and held high income careers and received better education. The profit the working class made was capital and benefited the people in the higher class, making them wealthier. Marxists did not believe this to be a fair nor a stable way for a society to run. Max Weber also contributed to the beliefs and attitudes towards social class. Weber further broke down classes so that there was more than simply the upper class and working class. Weber believed in the idea of stratification being important in social class. This refers to all the things that differentiate people, for example, level of education, health, and cultural background. Attitudes within society also reflected the importance of social class at this time, with separate schooling for children from different social classes. Before free and compulsory education was enforced in Australia in the 1870s, some children from working class families received very little education. While attitudes towards social class have certainly changed in past years, Mrs. Brown could still see the inequalities faced by children from working class backgrounds. At the beginning of the year, Mrs. Brown read an article about the performance of children from lower socio-economic groups. The article mentioned the results taken from recent national testing from across the state, which highlighted that 1 in 6 Australian children performed poorly in areas including literacy and numeracy. A large proportion of the students who scored poorly came from low socio-economic backgrounds. To successfully implement social justice into her classroom, Mrs. Brown developed a list of strategies that she can use to help make learning equal for all students, regardless of their social status. When developing her strategies, Mrs. Brown considered the different forms of habitus children will have in relation to their attitude towards schooling. Habitus is a term used by the socialist Pierre Bourdieu to explain how the values and attitudes children have toward education are passed down to them by their families. Mrs. Brown implemented the significance element of a quality teaching model in her class to help make learning more meaningful to students from families where education is not as highly regarded. Mrs. Brown also believed in the idea of meritocracy, where an individual's level of academic achievement determines what opportunities they will receive in life, rather than it being determined by the social class the individual was originally born into. Mrs. Brown incorporates this into her classroom through holding high expectations for all her students. Holding high expectations encourages students to work harder in order to meet those expectations. Some of Mrs. Brown's strategies are influenced by Bourdieu's theory of cultural capital. Cultural capital refers to the resources that parents have been able to gain through their own success, both at school and in later life, that they pass down to their children. This in turn shapes their children's education. Mrs. Brown wants to be able to help parents as well, so they in turn can help their children. Mrs. Brown understands that in general parents from working class backgrounds are less likely to get involved with their child's education than parents from middle class backgrounds. As such, Mrs. Brown wants to be more flexible so as to further encourage parent support, both in and out of school. Mrs. Brown also considered Bourdieu's theory of social capital when deciding what strategies she would use. Social capital refers to the various relationships or connections an individual has that they are able to use. Mrs. Brown incorporates social capital into her classroom through setting activities that require group work and collaboration. By the end of the term, Mrs. Brown was satisfied that she had done what she could to implement social inclusion in her classroom.